I think Alabama and Clemson are the only two teams that have repeated playing in the playoff. Anyway, I guess that's not important, but just came to mind. All right.
Oklahoma.
Oklahoma, Alabama?
Oh, you mean playing each
No, in
other?
regards to a matchup.
Oh,
I think
yes.
this is
Yeah.
just the second matchup that's been repeated in the
I think
playoff
I
era.
think you're right, but I'm not 100% positive on that.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure you're correct.
Ohio State, Clemson. We saw it in 2016. Buckeye fans would like to forget that and would like to move on to what the possibilities could be for a national championship here in 2019. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, breaking down the Buckeyes. We've got Pat Murphy on the line for Bucknuts to help us sort things out. Pat, how you doing today?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I am doing just fine. So this matchup, of course, announced on Sunday. And there was no drama for the first time during a 6-year playoff era in regards to who's that number 4 team going to be. We knew the 4 were very clear cut based on the conference championship weekend. The drama all centered around LSU and Ohio State. The Buckeyes are number 1 going into the final weekend. They beat Wisconsin after struggling early, scored 27 consecutive points, but apparently in the eyes of the playoff committee, that wasn't enough to hang on to number 1.
Correct. And you can argue all you want about the two teams' different resumes. What the committee valued in the end was that LSU had 4 wins against top 15 teams, including the convincing win this Saturday afternoon against Georgia in the SEC championship game. Ohio State had 5 top 25 wins, but not all of those were top 15. 2 of them were against the same Wisconsin team, which the committee said doesn't matter, but it's hard to not take that into account. And as you mentioned, Ohio State struggled some in that first half against Wisconsin going in. They were twice down 14 points. They went into the locker room down 21-7. Obviously make a big comeback to win the game, again by 2 scores. But after watching LSU earlier in the day, you go into that committee meeting, I imagine it's hard to not take that into consideration and say, look, LSU looked like the more dominant team. What we'd heard from the committee for the first few weeks was that Ohio State was a complete team, offense, defense, whereas LSU's offense was very good. Their defense was not quite as good as Ohio State's. These last 2 weeks, it's kind of been the opposite. Ohio State gave up yards through the air to Michigan, especially in that first half, gave up points. Same against Wisconsin. Now against Michigan, they were a little dinged up. You could say the same in the Big Ten championship game, but LSU gave up, I believe it was 17 points in the last 2 games. So proving that defense has improved. And on Saturday, they did it against the number 4 team in the country. Granted, Georgia's offense has not been outstanding this year, but you beat the number 4 team in the country the way they did. That's the committee's number 4 team. You're certainly going to get credit for that, and that's what the difference was. Now, you say, what does it matter being number 1, number 2? Well, you look at what Vegas thinks of these playoff matchups. I believe LSU is something like a 16-point favorite against number 4 Oklahoma, whereas number 2 Ohio State is a 2-point underdog to number 3 LSU or Clemson. I'm sorry, so many teams here. Number 3 Clemson. That you start to see, hey, if Ohio State had been able to be number 1, obviously Vegas thinks that's a big advantage. So Ryan Day and the Buckeyes all agreed that they thought they should be number 1, but said, if you want to win a national championship, you're going to have to beat one of these very good teams, and that includes Oklahoma. So they're just going to deal with it. I don't think you can worry about it too much. The matchup set. Ohio State's playing Clemson out in Phoenix, and you can't worry about not getting number 1 at this point.
I think at times we get caught up in somebody else's rankings a little bit too much in evaluating these teams, meaning that when you look at Wisconsin and Georgia, the defense for LSU catapulting itself, or the committee catapulting LSU past Ohio State, is that they just dominated the 4th best team in the country, and Ohio State was playing the 8th best team in the country. And yes, they struggled in the first half, but then they completely dominated the second half. So why is Wisconsin 8 and Georgia's 4? They both lost to, actually, the Wisconsin loss to Illinois now looks better than the Georgia loss to South Carolina. Illinois' posted a better record than South Carolina. And Wisconsin's other loss was because they had to play the number one team in the country on the road. Georgia did not have to play the equivalent, which would be going to Death Valley and LSU in the SEC. So just based on evaluation of the teams in the rankings, Georgia's magically 4 and Wisconsin's 8. I was impressed by the Ohio State comeback in that usually when you come back against a team, they implode. Wisconsin didn't show signs of that. They didn't turn the ball over. They didn't make stupid mistakes. They didn't blow coverages. There were no easy touchdowns. There were no big gaffes in Wisconsin's play in the second half. They just got physically dominated. It was just speed and quickness and athletic ability taking over. It wasn't Wisconsin handing them the game. There was the punt snap that was dropped, but that only resulted in a field goal, and Ohio State had stopped them anyway. So Ohio State's dominance in holding them to 35 yards and erasing a 2-touchdown deficit with 27 straight points was, in my eyes, even more impressive in some ways, again, because Wisconsin didn't hand it to them.
I agree with you. And, that was the conversation among those of us who were covering the game afterwards and in the morning hours before the announcement was made on Sunday was, how do you view these two games? How do you view these two resumes? And, you get the 13 or so committee members in there talking, and, it's ultimately what they came up with. And you're splitting hairs at that point, right? I mean, you're looking at two teams, both 13-0, dominated opposition, both have very good wins. There's not a game on either side where you look at and is like, that team just didn't have it that day. They were both very good, and one has to be one has to be two. If they'd flipped it, you could be talking to someone who covers LSU who is explaining why LSU may have had an argument for number one. So, again, I think you're splitting hairs there. It is very different this year because if you look at previous years, a lot of times, especially last year, for instance, the number 3 and number 4 teams, aren't too different. Notre Dame and Oklahoma weren't expected to beat Alabama and Clemson no matter what order they played in. Whereas this year, Clemson is a team that also probably had at least some argument to be number one, just with the way they completed their schedule undefeated. They've won every one of their last 8 games by more than 40 points. It's been a quiet rise for Clemson, but it's just kind of the way things shake out. Ohio State ends up with a more difficult matchup, but that's because there's 3 teams this year that had very good seasons and have at least some argument for number one. So again, I think, if you win this game, whoever it is, whether it's Ohio State or Clemson, I think they are then better set up to win the national championship. You'll get 15 or so days off, so it's not like you're going straight into that game beat up, but you'll have the momentum on your side. You'll have just beaten another, like for like opponent, so to speak, whereas LSU, assuming they beat Oklahoma as everyone expects, will probably have a pretty easy game. I imagine that'll be a bit of a shootout, but I think LSU is the better team. So, I think you'll have momentum on your side. I think you have a lot of confidence. It's similar to me in 2014 when Ohio State beat Alabama, and after that point they felt unbeatable. I heard one of the linebackers from that team interviewed on the radio this morning, and he said they could have played the New England Patriots and they felt like they still would have won. I don't know if that's quite true, but that's just the feeling you get from beating a team like that year's Alabama or this year's Clemson or Ohio State, whichever way it works out. So we could look back at this at the end and be like, this all worked out actually in their favor as opposed to this being a disadvantage. But we're not going to know until they play the games and see how it all plays out.
Ironically, for anybody out there that keeps track of my top 25, I have LSU at number 1 and Ohio State number 2. But I've had LSU number 1 for a long, long time, and I just didn't think that, based on the results and the quality of the opponents, I didn't think it was enough for that decision to be made to flip-flop them. In my eyes, I had already had LSU number 1. You go back to 2014, and I made the same comment yesterday, is that in retrospect, and even in the moment, once Ohio State won that game, I thought they won the national championship. I thought those were the 2 best teams, the 2 most talented teams, and that even though Ohio State was a 5-point underdog to Oregon in the national championship game, which still makes me shake my head, I don't understand that. Didn't they see the Rose Bowl from 2010? It was basically the same setup. Anyway, that that those were the two best teams, and that was the national championship game. Now, I don't think we have quite the same deal this year because LSU certainly there is, if groupthink is accurate, there are 3 1 and 1A teams here with the 1 through 3 seeds, Clemson, Ohio State, and LSU, versus Oklahoma being a step back, maybe being another Alabama, Baylor, Michigan team. Who knows how good they are? We'll see if they can step it up. But the seedings do matter because Ohio State's going to have to, if you want to go the cup half empty, you have to say, well, Ohio State's got to beat the two best teams in the country. Then the glass half full is basically what you just pointed out. If they do make it through Clemson, they got to feel invincible in a good way, not a complacent way, but a way to say, yeah, we just went through a war and we persevered and survived and we're ready for anything. And that was much like the Alabama game. From a battle-tested standpoint, Pat, it's interesting because this Ohio State team this version would be more battle-tested against good teams, Wisconsin twice, Penn State, Michigan, than Clemson, who's had a cakewalk through a bad schedule. And I know Clemson fans get on me all the time, but they played, it's not their fault. They played a bad schedule. But the Clemson team's battle-tested in the playoffs, and the Ohio State team, obviously, other than those freshmen that saw the field against Clemson in 2016, this is going to be a new experience for them.
Yeah, that'll certainly be a storyline as we go further. And, I asked a few guys we got to talk to on Sunday about the lack of playoff experience. And that was one of the things they pointed to was, especially these last 3 games, you go Penn State, Michigan, Wisconsin in the Big Ten championship game. Those are top 10, roughly top 15 teams that you had to play in back-to-back weeks. Now you get some time off, and there's obviously another one. But Clemson this year has played, I don't want to take anything away from the ACC, but as you said, the schedule hasn't been great. And that's just, how this year worked out. We've seen the same thing happen to Ohio State before in the Big Ten. You go back to 2007 when they ended up playing LSU in the national championship game. That was a very talented Ohio State team, but they hadn't been tested. And when they played LSU was the better team on that day just because of having gone through that throughout the season. So I think that's certainly one way to look at it. I think the other way is you've got a Clemson team that does have the experience of the playoff, comes into this game pretty fresh, given that they controlled all of their games. Now, Ohio State did too, winning every games by, at least 11 points. But these last few games were certainly, these last 3 specifically, were certainly a test physically, emotionally. Now you do have these 3 weeks to get healthy. And Ryan Day said they're going to have a practice week this first week, then have a week or a few days off where people can go home, players can go home. And that'll be over the National Signing Day. And then they'll get back and have a normal game week leading into Clemson. So there will be time for people to get healthy and whatnot. But Ohio State certainly went through the ringer here. I think proved that they can compete in the big games. And obviously they just kept getting bigger and bigger and will so with this Fiesta Bowl game on December 28th.
Pat, I can be the one to disregard the ACC for you because they do it on a daily basis.
All right.
The ACC in 16 games, other than Clemson, we'll take Clemson and their 2-0 record against the other Power 5 conferences out of the mix. I'll give you a guess on this one. 16 games against the Power 5 by the rest of the ACC. How many games do you think they've won?
Just based on the way you say that, I'm going to say 0.
2 and 14.
Okay.
And one of those wins was against Rutgers.
Oh, yes.
Boston College beat Rutgers.
Yeah.
North Carolina beat South Carolina. Otherwise, 14 losses against the Power 5.
Yeah, that's it'll be interesting. I certainly, I feel like this is a Clemson team that's built to win regardless of that. But with that said, there is something to going through a game or two in the season where you face some of that adversity. And obviously Clemson did early against North Carolina, some of those games even before that where Trevor Lawrence was inconsistent, throwing some interceptions. So, it's not as if they just ran through the schedule. Like I said, they have recently, these last 8 games have been pretty convincing. But yeah, you're right. They have not faced a team that is a, similar level of opponent, like for like in terms of what's across the ball from you. So when they do face that, I will certainly be interested to see how they respond in that Fiesta Bowl game. But This team just has so much talent. I think they're very well coached. I think that line at 2 points in Clemson's favor, you could have gone either way, Ohio State or Clemson favored, but that sounds right. Just a very close game. I haven't really dove into Clemson yet. In fact, I just started watching them more closely today. But from everything I saw throughout the season and reading about them a little bit, I think they deserve to be right there. And regardless of their schedule, this will be a fun one. I don't see it getting out of hand for either team.
Pat Murphy from Bucknuts joining us to talk Ohio State football, with the Buckeyes, of course, playing Clemson for the semifinal spot at the Fiesta Bowl. Should we be concerned about Justin Fields' knee?
I don't think so. I think you look back at this Wisconsin game. Was he as mobile as he normally is? No, but he still put in a Big Ten championship game, most valuable player performance. He was outstanding, especially in the second half. Once he kind of I was going to say calm down, but he said actually he was too calm in the first half, that he needed to kind of fire himself up and get going, and he was able to do that in the second half. Obviously, the offensive line, he gave up 3 sacks in the first half, but once they kind of figured out Wisconsin's blitzes and how they were coming at him, remember Wisconsin had already played Ohio State in the season, so they had film of themselves attacking this Ohio State offensive line and did a good job in the first half. But once Ohio State got that sorted out, I thought Justin Fields was just fine, moved the ball well, threw the ball well. Like I said, they have 3 weeks. It's a sprained MCL. We don't know how severe it is, but that's an injury that will certainly get better with 3 weeks off, not having to do a ton, not taking hits. He wore the bigger knee brace in the game, so his knee wasn't exactly jostled around. And I imagine he will be doing that in practice as well, leading into the Fiesta Bowl. But I do think against Clemson, you need a Justin Fields that can run. I was just watching some of Trevor Lawrence today and was surprised with how much he was able to move the ball on the ground when they needed him to. Justin Fields has to do the same thing. And, he needs to be the guy you saw earlier in the season against Wisconsin, against Penn State, that, when something's not there, he can take off and run, or they can call a read option play or a play that might involve him running, things like that. You're not going to be able to beat Clemson, I don't think, just dropping straight back. Obviously, J.K. Dobbins is a very good runner in his own right at running back, but you need that dual threat ability that Justin Fields brings that makes him so dangerous against a defense like Clemson's. I think he'll be much better running the ball in 3 weeks' time, and I think we'll have a better sense of that as we go along. Ohio State doesn't like to talk about injuries, but Fields has been pretty candid about where he is in terms of getting beat up against Michigan State and what's going on with the knee. So as we talk to him as it gets closer, I think we'll have a better idea. But unless there's a major setback for some reason, I don't know why he wouldn't at least be more improved in terms of his health than he was against Wisconsin.
MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football, breaking down the Buckeyes. We've got Pat Murphy on the line from Bucknuts. Of course, the Buckeyes are preparing for their huge semifinal matchup at the Fiesta Bowl with Clemson. And National Signing Day is just a week away on December 18th. Urban Meyer certainly addressed this with a first ever shot at a early signing date. Of course, traditionally the first Wednesday of February is when everyone is signed. But we've seen that the early signing date has taken over about 75 to 80% of the signees for Power 5 teams. And so it has almost become the National Signing Day. And there's a slight disadvantage for teams making a conference championship game in which it takes away the focus from the recruiting to the opponent. And especially when that conference championship game has a playoff berth attached to it as well. So, of course, this hasn't derailed Ohio State's recruiting efforts by any stretch, but I know that Urban Meyer addressed that the first year that he had to deal with it in regards to, okay, what is this going to look like and what are we going to need to do? And as soon as they beat Wisconsin, they were hopping on planes and buses and cars to get back out on the recruiting trail. So obviously they've got a lot of work to do in regards to preparing for Clemson, but also preparing for this early signing date.
It's interesting. Ryan Day talked about this last week. They were calling kids as other teams were visiting them and hey, sorry, we're not going to be around this week. We've obviously got the Big Ten championship game coming up. And the response, at least according to Coach Day, was that kids were like, that's a good problem to have, Coach. Take care of your business, that thing. And that's a lot easier to say when you're Ohio State and you have the number 4 class in the country, the number 1 class in the Big Ten, pretty much already wrapped up. They've got most of the guys that they want hard verbal commitments, ready to sign. Ryan Day said they're going to have, he believes, 15 early enrollees come in January. So these kids are all pretty committed. They've had this class pretty much locked down for a while, which is an advantage in that situation. But as soon as they could get out on the road recruiting, they did. This Sunday, obviously, they waited to hear the playoff announcement. But we spoke to Ryan Day quickly after Ohio State was announced as the number 2 team in the country, and that was an abbreviated press conference so he could get out and get on the road. When we talked to him on the Big Ten teleconference later that day, it was clear that both him and Coach Sweeney were out recruiting somewhere. So, and if you followed guys on social media, you'll see they're out visiting prospects across the country, making sure everything's in place for signing day for the guys they expect to sign then, and also working in some other guys. This class isn't going to get much bigger. They might take another running back or so, maybe another quarterback, a couple other positions, just depending on who's available. But like I said, this class has been pretty much locked up for a while. They don't expect any surprises really. And there may just be a few additions as we move forward here to this signing day, and then obviously the one you mentioned later. So yes, it's certainly, you lose a week of recruiting, but you also, either get to say you won the Big Ten championship like you did in Ohio State's case, or Wisconsin able to say, hey, we played in another Big Ten championship. That's a pretty good recruiting tour. And like I said, in Ohio State's case, most things were already all but signed, sealed, and delivered for this class.
Christmas is coming, folks. Shop Amazon. Use the link in the description section below to help us build the channels, the same shopping experience for you. Jeff Hafley, his name has been connected strongly with the Boston College job vacancy with Steve Adasio's being dismissed. Certainly, this is nothing new for programs across the country, and especially Ohio State. And when you have elite coaches and you're succeeding at this level, then teams are going to come after your coaching staff. Have they talked at all about, or is there any indication of, how time will be divided? And certainly he's not been hired for the job, but the way this has been played out in the past in these playoff and bowl situations regarding Ohio State's coaching staff.
I would imagine if Jeff Hafley is hired at Boston College, which it seems like he's at least their leading candidate. Our Bill Green has reported that the ball's kind of in Hafley's court in terms of, deciding if he wants this to be his first head coaching job. He's definitely a guy who wants to be a head coach, just making sure everything is the right fit. But I would assume if Jeff Hafley does take this job, that it will be very similar to what you've seen around the country at most places. And Ohio State obviously has had this happen before with coaches, is that, his focus during work hours will be with Ohio State, and Ryan Day will expect him to continue to do his job as he has, throughout this entire season. And he's done a great job at it. He'll have to then on his own time be, calling recruits for Boston College, trying to get coaching staff in place, everything like that. He also is, if we were just talking about recruiting, he's been a very great recruiter for Ohio State this year. And there were questions about that coming into the season. A guy who'd been in the NFL for so long, how would he handle recruiting? Well, according to the 24/7 Sports Composite, he's the 4th best coach in the nation when it comes to recruiting, and 2nd in the Big Ten, only behind Ohio State's wide receiver coach, Brian Hartline. He's landed a number of top DB prospects for Ohio State. Cody Simon, Cam Martinez are 2 others. So he's been very good, and Ohio State will certainly miss that going forward if he is indeed hired. So there's a lot to think about. And obviously we were just saying signing day is coming up. They've got to close out this class. Jeff Hafley is a big part of what this class has been built. So, I expect when there is an announcement on Jeff Hafley, and if that announcement is that he's leaving for Boston College, or if there's another job that he ends up taking, he will fulfill his commitments. He's very committed to this team. You can tell just from talking to him, this year at Ohio State has meant a lot. He's gotten to do a lot of things that he wasn't sure he was going to be able to do, in terms of competing on undefeated team, winning championships, and now competing for a national championship. So it means a lot to him. And if there's another job, obviously that will mean a lot to him too. But I'm very convinced a guy like him, he'll finish kind of what he started here. before he dives 100% into the other job, which is what I expect Ryan Day will ask of him or any coach coordinator that gets a job before the Buckeyes season is done.
Join Pat Murphy at Bucknuts. It's on the 247 Sports platform for Ohio State football. And, of course, like, comment, share the videos, and subscribe right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. Pat, thanks so much for stopping by to, again, break down the Buckeyes.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Very good. I think we've got 2 videos.